Good evening, everyone. My name is Luke Tannen, and I'm the Executive Director of Chicago Innovation, an organization that supports local innovators and entrepreneurs. And we are also a very proud partner and very proud customer of Wintrust, like I know many of you are in the audience too. In a moment, I will introduce today's event host, Melissa Donaldson. She is the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Wintrust. But first, I just wanted to take a pause and say it is such an honor to take part in today's event that celebrates Black History Month. You know, at Chicago Innovation, we do recognize that Black entrepreneurs, innovators, and business leaders have often been excluded from our history. And that is why we're committed to advancing our organization's vision statement, which is innovation is for everyone, and celebrating and amplifying the great work of Black innovators in Chicago through our year-round events and programming. We will continue to learn about and promote Black history and stand up for equality and justice. Because as today's event title appropriately states, equity is not an option, it is a must. And of all the companies in Chicago, and we know many, there are very few that live this motto better than Wintrust, a company whose values and commitment to diversity and inclusion I have always admired. Now, before we meet our incredible lineup of speakers today, we also know we have a great audience. And we want to learn more about your thoughts, so keep an eye out for a few polling questions throughout the event. Now it is my privilege to introduce our event host, Melissa Donaldson. Melissa was a speaker at our Innovation is for Everyone event that Chicago Innovation hosted last year. And to no one's surprise, she knocked it out of the park, which is exactly what she does day in and day out, leading the charge as Chief Diversity Officer for Wintrust. You know, Melissa, she's a trailblazer, she is a strategic change agent, and she's a great advocate for leadership, efficacy, inclusion, and very importantly, reinforcing humanity in business. So please welcome Melissa Donaldson.
Thank you, Luke. And good evening, everyone, and happy Black History Month. This is that annual celebration where we look at the many accomplishments and contributions of Black Americans in all facets of society. And speaking of history, we all witnessed the highs and lows of 2020, much of which will have lasting impact on individuals, families, businesses, and communities for years to come. While some would prefer to dismiss last year as a bad dream, in my opinion, 2020 provided the gifts of realization and reflection. The realization that equal is not synonymous with equitable, and the reflection that each of us has a responsibility to make the world a better place for all. Black History Month 2021 is an especially poignant one. Just 33 days ago, we witnessed history in the making with the swearing in of the first African-American, Asian-American, female Vice President of the United States. And we were dazzled by the Black Poet Laureate, who was the youngest to ever grace a presidential inauguration. Likewise, we collectively mourned the loss of giants, such as home run Hank Aaron, Hollywood grand dame Cicely Tyson, and the supreme Mary Wilson. We know the great minds, the great imaginations, and immense capabilities that these and other Black Americans have contributed to the world deserve to be honored and celebrated. Yet we cannot forget that there are countless others who feel oppressed and defeated. Why? Because systemic racism and inequity persists. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, when one of us is oppressed, all of us are diminished by that oppression. But what are the disparities that oppress people and stifle communities? The time is now to examine aspects of society where the lack of inequitable outcomes threaten to minimize our potential as a citizenry. Equity means something at Wintrust, and we have openly committed time and resources to studying this more deeply. For instance, as a signatory member of the CEO in Action national campaign, we have loaned one of our talented leaders of color to the CEO in Action for Racial Equity Fellowship full-time for 1 whole year as part of a cross-industry examination of economic development disparities linked to systemic racism. Additionally, active engagement and local collaborations allow for increased awareness of barriers to access and internal action planning through our 360-degree inclusivity platform. We dedicate this Black History Month to exploring how inequity manifests through systemic racism in the context of education, healthcare, community impact, and workforce outcomes, and the particularly damaging effects to the Black community. So welcome to our home. You are about to hear family talk, as my mother likes to say. This family includes CEO Ed Weimer and Wintrust boards of directors members who happen to be 5 highly accomplished African-American business leaders, each bringing diversity of background, diversity of perspective, and diversity of vocation. I experienced their personal commitments to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion firsthand, and I am immensely grateful for their guidance and support. We invite you, the audience, to be an active participant in this discussion as well. Participate in civil discourse with each other on the chat and submit any questions. Throughout the session, we will ask for your opinion through polling questions. Now, here is our first poll to give a sense of just what's on your mind. Paul, can you put up the poll, please? So which do you see as posing the greatest threat to societal well-being? Educational inequity, financial inequity, healthcare inequity, housing inequity, or workforce inequity? Please submit your response. Okay. Paul, can we see the responses yet? Okay, almost neck and neck. Educational inequity and financial inequity. Well, there you have it. So let's jump into it. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ed Weimer, founder and CEO of Wintrust Financial Corporation, and tonight's moderator. Ed founded Wintrust over 30 years ago, and today serves as advisory director of Wintrust's main operating subsidiaries. He's the only board member who is also a manager, happens to be my manager, of the company. And he shares his talent on many boards, including Northwestern Memorial Hospital Foundation, a trustee for Ann and Robert H. Lurie Hospital and Foundation, and the Archdiocese of Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Mr. Edward J. Weimer.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's a wonderful introduction, and thank you very much. And thank you for really hosting such an important conversation around a topic that is indicated by the title of today's program is necessary for us all to have. First of all, I'd like to thank our friends at Chicago Innovation for providing the technology to get this to you. Luke and Paul, thank you very much. We appreciate the partnership we have with you. This isn't our first rodeo in doing one of these. We've had a lot of fun doing them. So we appreciate your technology and your support, and thanks for doing that. I also want to thank each of our board members who have joined us to bring incredible value to this conversation. I'll keep this brief because I know we have an esteemed panel here to speak to the topic with way more expertise than I have. But I do want to start with Wintrust's commitment to equity. For the past year especially, many companies were forced to put their diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts front and center. The events of the year brought about a renewed energy and urgency to ensure that we're all doing our part to promote racial equity and nurture inclusive environments. For us, this is not a passing business trend. This is foundational work that we know we need to invest in. We also know these issues can't be resolved overnight. For many of us, and luckily, I do think Wintrust falls into this category, we're not starting from square one. We're certainly not crossing the finish line. We've already been doing a lot of work, and our approach is a little bit different than the canned approach you might see others take. While other companies show their effort through traditional philanthropy, the big banks like to call it where they fly in, they drop off a check, and they fly out. We work holistically. We approach our diversity and inclusion efforts from all different angles to hopefully provide long-lasting change. A few of the ones I'm most proud of include, we have strong partnerships with organizations who focus on this work, expanding our footprint into areas that are underserved, like our Waukegan branch that opened last year, our new North Lawndale location set to open this spring, it opened in Maywood, and many other places around Chicago. To be Chicago's bank, we need to serve every constituency in Chicago. We believe in investing in a diverse workforce. So this year is our 7th year as a leadership member of the Financial Service Pipeline Initiative, brought about by the Federal Reserve, focused on improving the amount of diverse talent in the financial industry. We also support having these conversations to help us all continue to learn and understand why this work is so important to all of us. For a while now, we've hosted events like this, tied to Heritage Months. I have to say, out of all these events we host, and there are quite a few, these are always some of my favorites. They're a good reminder that after all these years I've been around, there's still more to learn. I hope you come away with a conversation with the same feeling. So without further delay, let's jump in. Our first panelist who I'll talk to is Jim Clark, who's on the Wheaton Bank Board of Directors, Managing Principal of Wintrust Realty Advisors. Jim, welcome. Maybe you could give us a brief introduction and talk about your career journey. I'll have a couple questions for you.
Sure. Thank you, Ed. It's great to be a part of this. Thank Wintrust for dedicating time to this important discussion. I've had the pleasure of serving on the board of the Wheaton Bank and Trust, coming up on 4 years now, and coming up on 37 years in the commercial real estate and capital markets and finance industry. The last 19 of those, I've been the founder and managing principal of Wintrust, which is one of the few minority-owned commercial real estate brokerage and advisory firms in Chicago.
You didn't take our name, did you? Wintrust, Wintrust.
Yeah.
Not bad.
They go together like cousins.
I like that.
I'm also an ordained minister serving a predominantly African-American congregation. So it's given me a unique perspective on our economic system, how it works, and really how those who are privileged versus those who struggle at the short end of inequity face challenges on a daily basis. So delighted to be here.
Thank you. We're glad to have you, and we're proud that you're associated with our banks. Question for you. There's been a lot of media coverage recently related to inequity in the housing market. What is your perspective, and how can we create a change in sustainable ways?
So I'll just open by saying, clearly, as Melissa alluded to, the pandemics has unveiled deep and widening cracks in the foundation of the country, both socially and economically, whether it's our criminal justice system, social inequality, and especially economic disenfranchisement, which was, I think, one of the top items in the first poll, which are really critical default lines. The crisis in housing really is a fundamental driver of that. And, we often talk about inequity and home ownership, but I don't think we can talk about housing without talking about homelessness as well. And the last study, which was done, I think, January of last year, pre-pandemic, a point-in-time study, at any day, there were almost 5,500 people living in shelters. What's not widely known is that 77% of that population is Black, and that's pre-pandemic. So now with decreased bed capacity, job loss, and what is really a potential tsunami of evictions once the moratoriums are lifted, it only is likely to get much worse, and certainly something we can't overlook when we're talking about the crisis in housing. There's also a crisis in home ownership and tremendous disequity there, and be happy to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the discussion.
Great. Why don't we go for the first poll question here, which according to U.S. Census, The national rate of home ownership was, in 2019, was 65.1%. What is the national rate for Black ownership in Illinois? Share some music. Da 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 da. We got a little music playing there. Anyway, we got a big audience, so it takes a little time for them to get in. Luke, Paul, how we doing? The right answer is 41%. So only 12% of you knew that. Interesting. So, Jim, the Urban Institute found in the past 15 years, Black ownership, home ownership rates have declined to levels not seen since the 1960s. The rate in Illinois being, as I said, 41%. What do you make of that? What has been the greatest barrier to access?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's a sobering number, and you make the point, Ed, that you know, the disparity now is bigger than it was in 1960. 1960 was actually before the Fair Housing Act was implemented in 1968. And you know, it was 27 points difference there. Now it's 32. And what this reflects is a lot of what's happened, especially after 2000. I think we were making progress, but after 2000, Black ownership of homes dropped 2% to 2008. And then after 2010, it dropped another 5%. And what happened there that we all can, I think, remember is the impact of subprime lending, which had you know, left a lot of people of color, people in general, but especially people of color, taken advantage of when it came to financing and financing markets. The impact of that is bad credit histories, bankruptcies, and once you have that, digging out of that hole is a very difficult task. So I think that's been a big barrier is access to credit and sort of financial wherewithal. But I think another big barrier has just been net worth. There is another study that was done by the Brookings Institution that looked at the net worth, median net worth of white families and Black families. And for white families, it's about $170,000. For Black families, it's $17,000. So you've got a discrepancy, a 10x discrepancy in terms of net worth. And that means everything when you're trying to buy a home, when you're trying to put equity down, when you're getting approved for mortgage financing. So that's been another thing. And I think the last thing I would just mention is just the availability and the amount of capital that is lent to communities of color versus other communities. There was a study done last summer by WBEZ, which showed the amount of mortgage loans for new home acquisitions within Chicago. And 68% of the loans went to white communities, predominantly white communities, and only 8% to majority Black communities. And just to put this in perspective, more mortgage loans were made in the community of Lincoln Park or Lakeview or Westtown than all the Black communities in Chicago combined. So that confluence of factors is what's really, I think, creating the barriers to home ownership and to better equity, financial equity in communities of color.
How do you think we get around that? I know, you know, after the you know, the Great Recession and the mortgage security issue, the feds tightened up the rules on mortgages. Now, they were the ones who invented the subprime mortgage, basically the low doc, no doc, sometimes doc, maybe doc, what's up doc mortgages. And they didn't work. How do we get around that? Because We know that home ownership would build neighborhoods, which build communities, which build involve people, which means better education, better schooling. It's, there's so many different elements that fall into it. Where do you find the end of that spaghetti string?
Yeah.
What do you do first?
Well, again, this is a systemic problem, so there's not a quick solution. Many people on the call are probably in the finance industry or know a little bit about banking. And the biggest secret one of the biggest concepts in our industry is something called compound interest. Well, I think you can look at inequity in a similar way. There's been generations of inequity. And what you end up with is something that's going to take federal support, more legislation, new legislation, probably something like mortgage insurance for certain zip codes, better support for first-time home buyers. And then I think also probably revisiting appraisal standards in some of these communities. Appraisers do a great job, but they tend to drive looking through the rearview mirror based on what's happened in the past, and coming up with new and creative ways to be able to support financing to capitalize some of these communities is really what it's going to take, as well as just advocacy and access from the businesses that operate throughout the Chicago area.
I agree with you there. The appraisers were subject to new rules too after the Great Recession. So we made it tough for them. I mean, they don't want to get sued for getting into trouble. So something has to be done there. We have to start someplace. And there, as we said, there's no quick answer, but we have such great communities around Chicago that are falling apart because you have two houses that are abandoned, and that makes the other houses worth less. And it's just it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah, and it's going to take, I'd say access in terms of businesses that are willing to locate and have a visible presence in those communities, but also access in terms of folks in those communities being able to speak to bankers and others who can provide insight. For example, we're representing one of the largest wealth managers in the country who is going to be opening an office on the south side of Chicago so that they are actually in the neighborhood for providing their services, and residents don't have to go down to the loop. So I think it's going to be those kind of moves that will begin to open doors and opportunities, but it's going to take time, and it's gonna have to be consistent.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jim. We'll be back to you in a second. Why don't we move on now to Cecilia Gore, who's on the Town Bank Board of Directors. She's governance director of G.C. Schmidt.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. C.G. Schmidt, an executive director of the Brewers Community Foundation. I don't mean the Brewers, the beer guys. I mean our arch enemy from the Cubs, the Milwaukee Brewers, where we are the sponsor of also. So I don't feel so badly about that. So we got Cecilia on the screen. There you are.
Well, hello, Ed. How are you doing?
I'm
For
doing
some
great.
reason, I knew in my gut that you would bring up the fact that we had some competition between the two of us, but I never viewed us as arch enemies.
No. It's the White Sox, the Cubs, and the Brewers. I like them all. I don't like Christian Yelich. I wish he'd go away. But other than that, I like the Brewers. They're a fun team to watch, and especially that reliever with the hair. Hater?
Yep.
I'm not a hater. I'll tell you that. Sheila, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey, et cetera.
Well, thank you, Ed. Again, I'm Cecilia Gore. I'm the executive director of Brewers Community Foundation, which is the charitable arm of Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club. And I'm a lifelong resident of Milwaukee. I have been involved with community affairs, external affairs, and philanthropic efforts for a number of decades now. and really enjoy the work that I'm doing. The foundation that I'm running manages about 200 nonprofit grants annually in the areas of health, education, recreation, and basic needs. And our goal is to make sure that our baseball club serves as a part of the fabric of this community. So I'm pleased to be a part of that role. And then, as you mentioned, I serve on C.G. Schmidt Construction Company's board, along with Town Bank Board, and then a number of nonprofit organizations in this community.
That's great. Should we go right into the question, or do you want to?
Sure.
Okay. You've someone who's been involved with civic engagement your whole life. You work with the Brewers Foundation, exemplifies that. What are some examples of social inequity that you have encountered? And in your experience, what effect does civic engagement look like? I'm sorry, what does affect civic engagement look like? How can for-profit, not-for-profit organizations work better together to bring about change?
Well, if you'll bear with me, I have just a few brief remarks that will kind of capture what it is that you're asking me. But I want to start off by thanking you for your leadership. I appreciate your commitment to continuing this important discussion. I believe one of the most critically important actions for our journey toward equity is to craft strategies that are sustainable. So I think it's important to continue these discussions and engagement over a long period of time, because as you mentioned with the speaker before you, this isn't something that will be addressed right away. We need to recognize that this is a journey and that we have a responsibility to remain diligent in our efforts. And I feel we must keep chipping away at the complexities of inequities and racism for our very survival. Our future, the economy, and most importantly, countless human beings deserve to achieve equity at some point in our history. So I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge Jay Mack, who's the president and CEO of Town Bank, of which I'm on the board, and my fellow board members that have joined us for our webinar today. Town Bank has a growing commitment to racial equity and inclusion and recognizes the benefits of continuing to address barriers that exist for our employees, community stakeholders, and our customer base. And let me also bring greetings from Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club. We look forward to seeing Chicago at the ballpark in the upcoming season, and we appreciate Wintrust's corporate partnership. You mentioned that I work in the civic and philanthropic space, so I have the pleasure of working every day with a variety of people that are rolling up their sleeves with the goal of making a difference. And I'm sure that in Chicago and other communities in this region, we are all faced with similar challenges and seeking opportunities to make a difference. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is the largest city in the state of Wisconsin and the 5th largest city in Midwestern United States, behind Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Detroit, Michigan. Milwaukee is the 31st largest city in the United States. We have numerous positive attributes, and for many, we are viewed as a great place on a great lake. If I may, I would like to briefly lift up a couple of data points about Milwaukee that are disturbing. Black Milwaukee has been described frequently as the worst place for African Americans to live. And this is my hometown, so it breaks my heart to hear that. One of the issues that continues to plague us is segregation. First through historic racist housing policies and redlining, and then maintained by poverty. Our issues have been defined as hyper-segregation, which impacts the wealth gap, educational attainment, access to health and housing, and that has created crippling challenges. Persistent housing segregation has created an environment where 72% of Milwaukee's Black school children attend intensely segregated schools, the highest rate in the country. Our employment situation is similarly situated. A white high school dropout is over twice as likely to be employed in Milwaukee as a Black dropout. And white high school dropouts post a higher employment rate than Black high school graduates in Milwaukee. Poverty, income, wages, and household earnings statistics reveal wide disparities. Only 17.4% of Black males and only 14.6% of Black females in Milwaukee make more than $40,000 a year. Only 7.7% of Milwaukee's Black households report annual income over $100,000, which ranks next to lowest among the nation's 50 largest metro areas. Home ownership is particularly low among Black Milwaukeeans, while segregation remains as bad as it has ever been. Black and brown health has suffered because of racial inequities. I mention these issues because, as the title of our program suggests, equity is not an option, it's a must. I believe that short list of disparities provides enough of a framing for why we have no choice but to create and sustain change. In my role, I have the pleasure of working with a number of civic organizations in our community. The Greater Milwaukee Foundation, which serves as a vehicle for philanthropic and community engagement, is our community foundation. And they've committed to view all of their work through a racial equity and inclusion lens, with the goal of ending systemic racism in the city of Milwaukee. The Greater Milwaukee Committee, our civic organization consisting of our region's business, academic, and community leaders, are crafting significant opportunities to influence how various policies and practices can be examined with the goal of addressing inequities. The Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce has initiated the Region of Choice Corporate Pledge, which is serving as a commitment to providing a dynamic and supportive workplace for all our employees to foster their growth, success, and well-being. The pledge will also measure our progress as a business community toward goals against the current state of diverse employment. United Way, the YWCA, and other large nonprofits are providing educational opportunities to unlearn racism. Our city, county, and state government have declared racism as a public health crisis. There's a renewed commitment to addressing the historic inequities that exist in our community. I believe there is an acknowledgement that we have to do things differently to get a result. I'm witnessing a commitment to education from leaders in our community, unlike what I've seen before. I think there's a recognition that we need to be transformative versus transactional in our efforts. The commitment to a transformational approach to our work gives me hope. We have done many important things to move the needle on race with some results. I believe we need to tackle the greatest challenge, which is to dismantle systemic racism. The examination of barriers that are historically baked into who we are and what we do need to be examined and restructured. Until then, we will not get the outcomes that I believe we all would like to achieve. As leaders in our various communities, we are acknowledging the moment that we are presently experiencing. It is my hope that we are committing to a movement. The hard work requires us to look from the inside out, and that's tough, but I believe that where we are, and that's where we are, and that's what we must do. So I'm very happy that Wintrust, Town Bank, and the other corporate partners are along for this journey. Thanks, Ed.
Oh, well, it's going to be a journey too, because it can't go overnight. I think of this as being one generation away. If you look at all of the ethnicities that came during the early 1900s, the Germans, the Irish, they all came and they all took lousy jobs, got their kids in school, and the kids were able to live the American dream. And they beat them up until they did well in school. And so, I didn't beat them up, but yeah, back then they probably did. I had a Jesuit put a cigar out of my hand one day. That was fun. But it's the education is really, it's got to start with education. I think, like you mentioned that. According to the Harvard Gazette, good school, this is the poll question now. Good schools will close the educational gap among students of color faster and better than addressing other social factors, including curtailing violence and poverty. Do you agree or disagree?
I actually disagree. I don't think that we can identify one issue. I think they're all important, but most importantly, we need to get our arms around poverty. If I think back to when I grew up in several decades ago, um, people were employed, they were able to purchase homes, they could send their kids to school. Schools were better, there was more consistency in their home and their lives because they had jobs. And so I think that education is extremely important and we need to work on that as well, but we need to do it all.
You 59% of the people seem to agree with you. 39% disagree and 41% agree. Interesting numbers.
Yeah.
You've done a tremendous amount of work in various communities around Milwaukee and elsewhere. You said you don't agree with that statement, but what impact of educational inequity have you seen? Is there a magic wand that what would you do about it?
Well, we have a significant educational challenge in our community, just like others. Our public schools are struggling. Our financial model to fund schools has challenges.
Now, Milwaukee has or Wisconsin has vouchers, right?
Yes, yes, we do. And we have various levels of success. There are some schools that do well, and then there are a number that struggle. So I think it's important for us to wrap our arms around that. I know our business community has worked hard to look at education. We all have, but we've got to figure out how to do all of this well. We've got to look at these systems that exist and look at the policies and procedures that are in place and start to remove some of these barriers that are holding people back.
Do you believe in school choice? Is or not? I just wondering, I know it's controversial around Chicago with the unions and the like, but being on the board of the Archdiocese of Chicago and having suffered through nothing but Catholic schools my whole life, I'm wondering if competition in schools is good. And I would think that Milwaukee and Wisconsin has a leg up on Illinois, who really doesn't have the voucher system. You got to go where you got to go. Competition has to help schooling, and that competition would bring in more good kids and make everybody else kind of play the game, don't you think?
Well, I have mixed feelings. I believe that we definitely need a strong public school, but any school that exists, I want it to be a high quality school. So if it's a choice school, voucher, charter school, or public, I want it to be a high quality school. And what's challenging is the access to resources. It's not equal. So you might have a private school that has a significant number of donors that are interested in that school, and they can send resources that will make that school function better. And then you'll have another school that has people that are committed to educating the kids at that school, but they don't have access to resources. So you've got to have some equity around what people that can access, or you really don't have a fair playing field.
Okay.
I too went to Catholic school, so I got my fair share of whacks on the hand with the rulers.
You got the scars to prove it, huh?
I do.
Yeah. I had the nuns and I had the Jesuits who were like the nuns on steroids. It was at 8 years of Jesuits, but you certainly learned, that's for sure. And
But I feel our kids deserve quality education. And whatever that system shows up and looks like, we need to figure it out.
Yeah, and sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
If you don't, we're going to move on to our next panelist now. Dr. Suzette Mckinney, who's on the board of Wintrust Wealth Management. She's a principal and director of Sterling Bay Life Science Division. Sterling Bay is a wonderful client of ours and good pals. And so now we have two connections with you, Suzette. You want to give a little personal introduction and about your career journey, then we'll hit you with some questions.
Sure. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for having me this evening as a part of this esteemed panel. So as you said, my name is Dr. Suzette Mckinney, and I serve as a principal and director of life sciences at Sterling Bay. I have had a long-standing, almost 20-year career in the field of public health. Just prior to coming here to Sterling Bay, just 5 days ago, I served as the CEO and executive director of the Illinois Medical District, which is a healthcare and technology innovation district on Chicago's near west side, the second largest urban medical district in the country. And prior to that, I served almost 14 years at the Chicago Department of Public Health, where I oversaw our emergency preparedness and response efforts on both the public health side and the healthcare side. I'm a native Chicagoan, born and raised here, proud graduate of Whitney Young High School. And I have been on the board of Wintrust Wealth Management for just over 2 years now.
That's great. We appreciate your help and have other things in mind for you too, as you know. So
Thank you.
we'll leave that as said as it is. Doctor, the pandemic magnified the inequity in healthcare, with Black and Latino communities experiencing deaths due to COVID at a much higher rate than other groups. So public health professional, what do you see as the biggest cause of the disparities and what needs to be done?
Well, I would say the biggest causes, plural, of these disparities are the fact that Black and Latino communities suffer from chronic health conditions and poor health outcomes at rates that are disproportionately higher than their white counterparts. What we know is that many of these disparities are due to what we call the social determinants of health, which are conditions in the environments where we are born, where we live, where we learn, where we work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. Those are things, and when I say those, I mean the social determinants of health, are things like lack of access to jobs or lack of access to education. Substandard housing is another example, and even poor neighborhood infrastructure. And there are many more social determinants of health, but those are the most common ones that we talk about. When we think about what needs to be done, I believe we need to acknowledge and address longstanding policies that created segregation here in our city and in other cities like Chicago, which alienated communities from transportation infrastructure and other social determinants that severely restricted access to the things that enable people living in these communities to fully participate in educational and employment opportunities, and even other resources that contribute to a more equitable quality of life. Today, I believe that we need to be more intentional about creating access and opportunity for Black and Latino community members to access education and employment, but also social and cultural resources that serve to both elevate and empower the communities from where they originate.
It's interesting. About 2 or 3 years ago, we had a panel down at 231 LaSalle for Black History Month. And I met a young lady who, I can't remember her name, unfortunately. I get old, you forget names. But you probably know her. She vetted the company that does hair care, started her own company.
Christia Donaldson.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Yeah.
So we were talking beforehand, and she was talking about she had started a small foundation to look. She's a breast cancer survivor and had started a little foundation to look into that. And she gave me this, I just found it remarkable. And as a result, with her help, she went with us down to Northwestern. We gave a grant for Northwestern to study why African Americans are more predominant, are more prevalent to get breast cancer and men's cancer, prostate cancer. And it's just hit me as it's just not right. People shouldn't have to deal with that. Which so far, our studies at Northwestern have shown that they can put them, the bus out or whatever that has the mammogram in it. People can get the blood test. The men can get the blood test, but they get the reports, but they just can't get back to do the follow-up. They can't afford the follow-up. Number one, for healthcare. Number two, they can't even get there because they've got kids to watch and other responsibilities. Their job will not give them the time off to do it. I just think I can't wait to see the end of the results of this, because we gave them pretty hunk of money to do it. Not that the money means anything, but it's a big project. I just say that to be the scope of the project, but
Sure.
It really starts showing to me the domino effect of all of this. Well, I got to work, I can't do it, and then they end up dying, which certainly is not what you want to happen. More and more I'm learning as we're going through this. These are great questions and great answers. How intertwined it all is, and there's going to be no secret answer to all this. There's not one answer at the end of this Rubik's Cube that's going to work.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And we also cannot forget the fact that many people don't go back for follow-ups because they don't want to be embarrassed by the provider. They don't want to feel as though the provider is talking down to them or treating them as though they are less than because of their skin color. And that's another very big issue that we also see with patients, even seeking medical treatment the first time, let alone for a follow-up.
Yeah. Very interesting. One of our great partners, this is the new poll question. One of our great partners, the Chicago Urban League, released a study called An Epidemic of Inequities, Structural Racism and COVID-19 in the Black Community. Which do you feel is the biggest contributor to Black mortality rates? Segregation, racial discrimination in healthcare, poverty, environmental contaminants, pre-existing health conditions. Give a second for them to tally. We should have the music play. Da, 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 da. Here we go.
Wow.
Our audience thinks poverty is the biggest, followed by racial discrimination in healthcare. And the rest are all about equal except for environmental contaminants.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think of that? What's your perspective on that?
I actually agree with the audience, but I believe that all of those risks play a role in mortality, and they also play a large role in the disparities that I spoke about earlier. And I would add, that they also play a role in our region's economic vitality. You mentioned the report by the Chicago Urban League. I would offer an additional report by the Metropolitan Planning Council called The Cost of Segregation. And in that report, they highlight the devastating impacts of hypersegregation has caused, including all of the factors that we see on that list. And I'll say that the report is publicly available. You can Google it and find it. It's actually on the MPC website. But one statistic that I found incredible from that report indicates that the Chicago region's gross domestic product, which is a leading measure of our economic performance, would rise by approximately $8 billion if we simply reduced the levels of economic and the levels of economic segregation and African-American white segregation to the national media. And I just think that it's incredible to know that we have these long-standing governmental policies that created this hyper-segregation, which contributed to large rates of poverty and racial discrimination across the board, as well as poor neighborhood infrastructure that has contributed to these economic contaminants. And not only is it affecting the health and well-being of people living in these segregated communities, but it's also having a devastating impact on our region's economic vitality. And so the solutions will need to be, robust and long-standing and intentional, because these are systemic issues that will not change overnight.
Being on the board of the MPC, I've read that report, and I can't say that I disagree with it. It's not on there, and it's probably a third rail. I probably should step up. I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to ask you though, because you got to ask the tough questions, right?
Yes.
What about family formation in the Black communities? It's less than in the other communities. Does that play a factor? How do we solve that?
What do you mean when you say family formation?
I mean, the typical family of husband, wife, kids.
Sure. I think that there are a number of stressors in many of these communities that impact the way families are formed. I think historically in the Black community, Black Americans have learned to just be survivors of circumstance. And so, we oftentimes see situations that become so stressful that one parent or the other cannot handle the situation and decide to remove themselves. And then the parent that remains and the other family members that remain step up and do what's necessary as best as they can to care for the children and the rest of the family. That certainly has been, the experience that I've seen in my lifetime, and it's been the experience that I've seen in the families of many of my friends and colleagues. I think it's difficult for people who don't have lived experience in these communities to understand why some families form in particular ways. But, Melissa said we are having a on the couch conversation. I would just say, if we could all have that ideal family, we probably could. But when we find ourselves in a situation where we can't, we do what we have to do to take care of ourselves and our family members.
Fair enough. Thank you. We're going to move on now to Cheryl Thomas. She's on the Wintrust Bank Board of Directors, former president and CEO of Ardmore Associates, an engineering consulting firm. Welcome, Cheryl.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here with you and on your distinguished board. I mean, this is really fantastic. I'll tell you a bit about myself. I've had a very long and storied career. As Cecilia would say, it goes decades. I started out my career as a research chemist for the city of Chicago. I worked in various infrastructure departments after I'd gone back to school for engineering. So my undergrad and graduate degrees were in chemistry and the typical STEM fields of chemistry and physics and engineering. And I worked for 20 some odd years in public works, water, sewers. I never was on the back of a garbage truck. I missed streets and sand, so I didn't get there. But I worked in the mayor's office. I ran the infrastructure departments for Mayor Daley, and I was building commissioner for 4 years before I left the city of Chicago to join the second Clinton administration. And I was the chairman of the Railroad Retirement Board in the Clinton administration. We decide for taxing purposes what is and isn't a railroad because many of the railroads were owned by holding companies. And I was there for 5 years. And with my background in infrastructure and engineering, I started Ardmore Associates in 2003, and we managed high-profile projects for the city of Chicago, for government, for private concerns as well. And we were civil engineers, program managers, project managers, and construction managers. Through my career, many times I was the first and the only. And as that saying goes, you have to make sure that you mentor and give back so that you are not the last. And I certainly do that. And I've served on various nonprofit and for-profit boards. And like you, Ed, I am a product of the Catholic school system, and I had the Jesuits for university, undergrad and grad school. But my career, my academic career was formed and nurtured by many a nun who let you know when you were doing something that wasn't pleasant. I often said I had the Sisters of Mercy who had no mercy, and in my case, that was a good thing. I merged Ardmore with the Roderick Group, which was a civil engineering firm. Rashad Johnson was a product as well of St. Ignatius College Prep, whom I met because I served on their board for.
You couldn't get into Loyola Academy, huh?
He couldn't get into Loyola Academy, so he went to Ignatius. And so we merged the two firms, and now we're a full service engineering firm. We did not do design at Ardmore Associates. We did mostly construction management, but with the merger with the Roderick Group, it became a full service engineering firm. And now Rashad Johnson is the president and CEO of the Roderick Group. So that's my journey.
Tell you, one of my first jobs was through college. I would work for a civil engineering company. You just go out and hold the pole. You had to hold the pole, and guy, to get your elevations right.
Get your elevations.
Yeah, and my second and third years, they said, well, you're smart enough. I ran a crew. So they said,
Lovely.
Don't put you're an accounting major, tell me an engineering major. I only put one sewer in the wrong place, but they were able to fix it really quick.
Oh, that's okay. We can handle one sewer in the wrong place.
Well, they put a T in, it worked out fine. And
There you are.
But they were paying me $6 an hour, billing me out at 50. So I have no complaints about that. Got to be outside all day. Cheryl, given your experience working in infrastructure, transportation, engineering in all these municipalities and communities and federally, I guess, how would you describe transportation inequity, and how have communities been adversely affected? Something we don't often hear about is environmental inequity that shows up in contaminated water supplies, for example. Your perspective, how do we combat this?
Well, first of all, there is something, just like the various studies out there, we all know that these inequities exist. And I want to refer you to something called Holy Post, and it's on YouTube. A distinguished professor did this YouTube where he points out how we move the jobs to the suburbs, and then there's no transportation for minorities to get to the jobs. And then we say, why don't you work, or why don't you want to work, which is absolutely ridiculous. Of course, there are transportation inequities. Many times minorities live in the center of large cities, and these industrial parks now are out in the suburbs. I can remember as a young person that there were all kinds of bakeries and factories and butcher shops and whatever. All of that was done at the stockyards. I remember them. I mean, all that was done here in the city of Chicago. And as with any of the large cities, it's been moved out. And so you have to have a car. If you're poor, you probably don't, or you absolutely try to carpool with others. And if you don't have that option, then you're not working. So there certainly are these transportation inequities, which I would have to say that now I would like to give credit to some of the suburban communities and the city of Chicago as well in extending the transportation lines. For instance, and I'm sure in your and my lifetime, there's been the Blue Line, which was extended all the way to O'Hare. that created a lot of jobs for people because that too is an industrial complex out there at the airport. And to take the blue line to be able to get out there was a big thing for minorities and women, for Blacks and Hispanics and women. So that's a good thing. The red line will be extended yet again. So it's going out to the areas where you have the industrial parks and where the jobs are located. In terms of the environmental inequities, some of the factories that are left are absolutely spewing all kinds of contaminants that minorities who live near those factories are breathing. You have noted that minorities have a disproportionate amount of asthma and some of these other conditions that are caused by the poisonous effluents from factories. You refer to the water, contamination of water. I don't want to indict anyone, but how ridiculous in Flint, Michigan, where you live in Michigan, where you have a water source that is incredible. The Lake Michigan, the Great Lakes are the purest water source in the world almost. And to save money or to do something different, you change your water source to a river, which has all kinds of contaminants and effluents. Makes no sense at all. Who did it impact? Majority, it impacted minority communities. So these are the sorts of things that you have to be cognizant of. And I would have to say that social media really has played an important role in getting information out there. Yeah, there's a lot that social media does that I think many of us don't like, but there's good things that it does as well. And it provides information. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. The river filled with effluent, we like to say.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. But I do.
Go ahead.
Yes, no, I do think that in terms of transportation, I do think that now we may get more money from the federal government. There's going to be a $1.9 trillion bill out there. A lot of that bill will be for infrastructure and transportation. We have a 60-year deferred maintenance on bridges in this country. And we're so lucky that we haven't had a major failure that's been due to the deferred maintenance of bridges in the United States.
None of the bridges I put up fell down, I'll tell you that. At least they haven't fallen down yet.
Not yet.
Let's do our poll question here. Cranes reported that a key problem is in hiring diverse workforce was getting employees to the work sites, availability of childcare, compensation requirements, and flexible work schedules. There you go.
I love it.
Ask these guys at Innovation are pretty good, aren't they?
Yeah, they're really good.
Yeah, here we go. Like you're saying, getting the work sites.
Yeah, I think that if people have a job, they find a way to make the other things work. And flexibility now is becoming very important. We've learned that with COVID, that you can be flexible with work schedules and having people come to the office or not. But getting employees to work site it's very, very important. And we have to ensure that we do that. I would say that our European counterparts are a little better at this than we are, but I am hopeful that now that a light has been shed on it, that we're going to do all that we can to make sure that if you move a plant out to the far suburbs, that you're going to make sure that people have a means to get there.
Couldn't agree more. It's going to be interesting as we come back from this, what's going to look like in the workforce. I mean, we're struggling with it now. Wintrust is coming with an equitable plan because you do want people here some of the time at least, because young people aren't getting the mentorship, not learning the culture.
Right.
It's really a tough one, but we're embarking on that journey now to figure that out. But anyhow, thank you. I will
Thank
move on
you.
now, if I can, to Alex Washington. Last but not least, he is on the Wintrust Bank Board of Directors and the Wintrust Corporate Board of Directors. He's a managing director of WinPoint Partners private equity firm.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Why
Good.
don't you tell us a little about yourself and your journey, and then I'm gonna beat you up with like 18 tough questions.
All right. That's what I get for being last, right? But thanks. I appreciate, as others have said as well, the opportunity to be on this panel and share some thoughts with everybody. Just in terms of personal background, I'm a kid from the Midwest. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. A diehard Detroit sports fan, so that doesn't always make me the most popular in Chicago, although we haven't had much to brag about in a long time. So it makes it a little easier. As you mentioned, I'm currently a managing director with WinPoint. We're a Chicago-based private equity firm. We've got about $3 billion in assets under management. And I'll talk a little bit more about private equity a little bit later. I'm a graduate of Morehouse College. And I was a finance economics major there. Afterward, I joined McKinsey & Company and spent time as an analyst. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School, and then spent a good chunk of my professional career sort of in the investment arena, both on Wall Street and then at WinPoint. And I joined the Wintrust Bank Board in 2016. And then more recently in 2020, the Wintrust Financial Board as well. Outside of that, I'm a board member of the Chicago Urban League, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and was the past chairman of the Chicago Foundation for Education. So it's a little bit about me.
That's great. Probably ask you, we brought you on the education one, but I'm going to, private equity is a pretty specialized space. What does equity in business look like for you? And does a company's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion have any bearing on how you select investment opportunities? What do you consider?
Yeah, maybe I'll address private equity more generally first, and then talk a little bit about
Sure.
how it's evolving and how we're thinking about it at WinPoint. The honest and disappointing answer is that historically, no. Private equity has been a very exclusive club. And it's one that people of diverse backgrounds, women, people of color, have been excluded from for a very long time. That's changing to some degree in recent years, and we could talk a little bit about that. But if you just look at the absolute raw data and statistics, there's a study that was commissioned and executed by Harvard Business School by the Knight Foundation. And they concluded that of the 70 trillion in assets under management, only 1.3% is managed by diverse firms. And that's defined as being firms where you either have a woman or a person of color or people that own more than 25% of the firm. So that's woefully inadequate. Within my specific industry, private equity, the numbers are, between 3 and 4% in terms of true diverse representation in the industry. And it's even more stark if you start to get down into venture capital, where it's probably more at 1%. So, those statistics are particularly stark when you think about the fact that private equity represents 5% of US GDP. Over 15,000 companies in the United States now are private equity backed, and the industry employs, through portfolio companies, over 10 million people. And so it is a significant generator of wealth, of employment, of opportunity in our country. And historically, this topic of diversity and inclusion has not been one that it's been an area of focus. Now, what I would say is that that's changing. And that change is a reflection of external pressure, And it's a reflection, a bit of competition. On the external side, our customers are pension funds, largely insurers, and others, and they are demanding greater transparency and greater accountability by the industry. And so what that means is that, we are having to report more on and talk about how we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our business practices with our portfolio companies. Now that's in the very early innings. And so there's a long way to go, but the fact that that discussion is occurring now at multiple levels is a positive change. That all being said, I think I'm a capitalist at heart, and I got into this industry because of that. And so I think the most significant and sustainable way that we're going to drive this issue in our industry is to reflect on the fact that you take morality, take ethics out of it. And if you just focus on the fact that women and people of color are undervalued, that should get the industry's attention. Right? We are in the business of thinking about, how do you identify undervalued assets where there's an opportunity to produce a disproportionate return. And if you look at the data, particularly of high-performing women-led private equity venture firms and those for people of color, they've consistently outperformed. There's great data from NAIC that shows over a 7-year period that firms with those backgrounds produce 20% net IRRs. If you can produce a 20% net internal rate of return, you should be drawing capital. And so what we have to do is continue to shine the light on that and make sure that people understand that this isn't a philanthropic venture. This is an economic.
Yeah. John Rogers is very vocal about the lack of color in the investment business also. And he's beating the drum pretty loudly on that. And he was on the panel last year, I think. He and Israel O'Donoghue, I felt like I had a real smart guy on one side, a really big guy on the other side. So
that's right.
But yeah, it is inequity, and I think a lot of it is just education, and you have to understand that and bring them up. So education is important. But let's go to the next poll question.
Sure.
Since 1955, how many Black CEOs have led Fortune 500 companies? Where's the music, guys? I love the music.
Yeah, we lost the music.
There you go. The answer is
15.
The answer is, I got 19. It's not even up there.
I've got 19 too. It wasn't on the, I think the polling question may not have offered that one up.
Yeah, well, 15 was close enough and they won. So
yeah,
not bad. Not that you win anything for it, but so 19 out of 1,800 CEOs have been Black.
Yeah.
There are only 5 on the 2020 list. How are we gonna deal with that and the leadership side of things?
Well, my first reaction to it is that the 5 that are on the list have to be exceptional, right? It's table stakes. The fact that that number is sort of so anemic over the sort of span of the Fortune. Was that the Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000? I think it's Fortune
500.
500. Look, I think it's reflective of a couple of different things. In our business model, at Windpoint, the most critical thing that we're focused on is talent. You can, look at, various industries and businesses, but ultimately leadership is critical. And, but you don't become a CEO overnight unless you're a founder or an entrepreneur, right? I mean, there's successive roles that you have through your career, where you're gaining increased experience, you're demonstrating proficiency, and adding value. And that, hopefully, it sort of lead to being in the consideration to be a CEO. The reality is that as you move up, your functional expertise becomes less critical, in my opinion, versus two other factors, which is your ability to lead and develop teams, and your ability to drive revenue in business. How commercial are you? And
Having a vision is important too.
Absolutely. But those aspects, require, at times being in a position where it can be lonely. It can be lonely being the only one in the room. It can be challenging to sort of gain acceptance, particularly at the middle sort of ranks in your career, to gain those types of experiences and demonstrate it. And so I think what sometimes happens for African American and minority executives is that they top out, and they top out without having the opportunity to demonstrate that they're able to sort of rise to that level within the organization. What can we do about that? I think some of it is mentorship earlier in career. And being able to have those sets of exposures. I think it's also a function of truly having accountability, but I think it's also transparency. And organizations need to be intentional around thinking about the trajectory of their diverse workforce and making sure that people are afforded opportunities to demonstrate what they can do.
Well, thank you. Guys, if it's okay with you, we're going to run a little bit over since we only have really 5 minutes left. Hopefully nobody has to run off someplace. I know where we're staying between you and your first cocktail or whatever, but I'd like to get to some of these all panelist group discussions because I find this myself very informative and really thought provoking more than anything. So we got everybody on here. Okay, everybody, you guys at Chicago Innovation. Okay, we run a little over, do we? Do you? Guess not.
We're good, Ed.
We're good,
From a
great.
tech standpoint, Ed, totally fine to continue on, yes.
Thank you. I think this is, I'm really enjoying this. I'm learning a lot. The all panelists group discussion. So I'm gonna throw this out there. Why has the racial gap persisted for so long? Why has it been so hard to eradicate? And what is the impact? Well, we know what the impact of prolonged inequity on the greater good is, but I'll let you respond to that. Everybody come on back.
I'll take one shot at that just to sort of open it up a little bit. On the question of what's the impact of that, I think Suzette touched on it for sure, and some others, which is that we've got a real inequity issue here within our country in terms of the erosion of the middle class, and we're seeing that in a significant way, and it's tearing at our communities. But I think that people lose sight of the fact that a true middle class has only existed generally in the United States for maybe the last 100 years, sort of a post-World War I sort of effect. And for women and people of color, for a much shorter period of time than that. But, the issues in our communities oftentimes are sort of the canary in the coal mine for the broader, population. And if anything, we hopefully should be taken away from the last year is that we've got to address these issues in a significant way. Otherwise, we've got a massive challenge as it relates to continuing inequality, in the erosion of that middle class in our country. And if capitalism doesn't address it, some folks are going to argue that maybe capitalism isn't the solution.
Yeah, I would agree with Alex's comments, but I would also say, we need to understand that racism is systemically deep in our society, and it's difficult to understand unless you've experienced it, that there are just some practices that take place that are designed to intentionally hold people down and hold people back. And that has contributed significantly to all of these inequities that we're talking about. And, and I'll just speak anecdotally, I remember when I was touring high schools with my daughter and visited a very affluent, private, independent high school and learned about a practice that they had to give students tests. And it was designed to take the majority of the African American students and put them on one track and put other students on a different track. And those other students on that different track received a higher degree of training and education than the separate track. And all I will say to that for my family, specifically my daughter, is thank God for the Jesuits, because she went to St. Ignatius College Prep and got a marvelous education. But I was floored to not so much learn about that practice at the other school, but to see it being so openly and aggressively enacted.
One comment I'll throw in, I think that people can easily live in their bubbles. And so there are so many people that don't really have to be exposed to what other people are focused on. And I'll point to COVID as an example. I think COVID has provided a way for us to look at how we're experiencing disparities in a way that we never have before. So you think about the essential worker, and all of the discussion around how essential workers are impacted and how they contribute to our culture. And so if you remove essential workers, which in many cases are Black and brown folks, you've got a significant challenge. So I believe that in many ways, there's exposure that hasn't happened at the same magnitude that it's happening now, and it's opening people's eyes.
I also think that you have to change a mindset. There is a mindset that Black and brown and women, quote, aren't as smart as other people. And certainly I'm no genius, but it always amazed me in my career when someone would say, oh my God, I can't believe you're so smart. It's like, well, why would you not think that I'm not smart? And
I get that all the time, by the way.
And so you really have to change the mindset in that any and every, just because you're looking at the color of someone's skin or because they're a woman does not mean that they can't do what you can do. So I think in this country, you really have to do that as well.
And then if we're honest, we have not been fully educated. So when we talk about the systems that exist and there are things that are in place that we thought were good things, like the GI Bill, for example, we didn't realize that for many people, it didn't work for them. Or, you look at Black history and there's just a flood of information around the amazing things that people of color, Black folks have invented or created or waited. We've never heard these stories. So when we don't hear that, then it's not respected. And so then we have a challenge.
Jim, you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I would just add that prolonged inequity not only threatens the social fabric and civil fabric of the country, but I think it stifles and plateaus our productive capacity. You think about the impact on the economy when women came into the workforce and how it put us on a whole new trajectory. McKinsey just released a study, I think this month, that showed that if you were to narrow the wealth gap between white and Black and white and Latinx communities, you could add $2 to $3 trillion to the productive capacity of the country, which is 8 to 12% of GDP. So I think part of the realization is that this country is not going to realize its potential to grow even further until everyone is a part of the the pie of making things work and excelling.
It makes sense, and education has to fall right to the top of the list here, because I'll tell you, we have a very hard time bringing in people from Morehouse and other universities to come in and take senior positions with us. I mean, Wintrust has been, when we first started Wintrust, we took on the complexion of the town. I started in Lake Forest. There weren't many people of color in Lake Forest. As we move out, we've got more and more exposure to different neighborhoods and markets. And we take on the complexion, if you will, of those markets. As we try to bring in young people into our training programs, what have you, we have such a hard time because people from Morehouse, and we had a director previously from Morehouse who was on the holding company board. We met with the president and everybody, but they get sucked up so quickly. So I think education is so important. Why we took our IOU approach, in, over, and up, to bring people in at the young age and bring them up and give them everything they need to move ahead. We need to bring people over from other firms to come work at Wintrust to fill the senior positions, and it's hard to find. It's hard to find those people right now. I think it's because of the education side. We have to do something to increase the population of people interested and are qualified for the business, or to be in the business, at least have the basics. And I think it boils down to education. Why I said earlier, I think it's one generation away, but what do I know?
So too.
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir.
I would just say that I do think it's important to look at the people that are currently working within not just your firm, but others. Because what I've seen throughout my career is this interest in looking elsewhere when you have people in your organization that could be nurtured and moved up.
That's the up part, in, over, and up. And that's what we're doing with that.
I think it's really important to recognize that talent is often right in front of your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
But we might take it for granted and overlook it. So I like that concept.
Yeah, the up part is with your Wintrust University, through the groups that Melissa has put together. We're gonna get the up part going, because as we continue to grow and expand, we need those people to come with us, who understand the philosophy, our approach. I mean, our culture is a lot different than everybody else's, and you get it. You're dynamite. If you can understand our culture and be able to move up in it, it's terrific for everybody involved. One final question, anybody can respond. What gives you hope in the fight? What's giving you hope?
Well, I would say from my perspective, I think hope comes from when we look at our young people, their voice, their intelligence, they're, I think, raised with a more open orientation towards a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, and they're the consumers of tomorrow. So ultimately, if service providers and companies want to be able to sell products, they're going to have to address the priorities of that base of consumers that they're looking to. So my hope is in the young people, and I think the influence they're going to have going forward.
I would agree with that. I think that Jim made an excellent point there, and I think it's not only from a customer standpoint, but also your ability to attract talent. I know that in a number of our companies, younger people are definitely making decisions if they believe the organization is not reflective and is not embracing everything that we've been talking about. And so you will be putting yourself in a position where you're not as competitive or non-competitive if you're not responding to this in a significant way. And I think it becomes this issue of cultural fit, where people feel like, well, it doesn't fit my culture, but that becomes a discussion about personality fit, versus skill set and true diversity. And I think that's an important element that we have to get beyond, is this idea that cultural fit is so important that you can't have true diversity.
I would agree with everything that's been said, but I'd also say that another thing that gives me hope is that we are actually having this conversation today. And, but I would also say that what's important is, while we are having this conversation, this very type of conversation needs to be continuous, and it needs to be happening in other areas as well. We need to be looking for talent from the top to the bottom, you know, in the C-suite, on the board, and among the rank and file. And I think where, for those of us who are business leaders, where we don't believe we've been able to find talent, then perhaps we have to create ways for talent to find us. But I think we are moving to the point where we can no longer rely on, you know, the saying that, oh, you know, we're having a difficult time finding talent. You know, when you think about women, when you think about minorities, just look at some of the two most significant things that have happened just in the last 6 months. You know, a Black woman helped develop the COVID-19 vaccine, and another woman helped, you know, and a craft land on Mars.
Right.
So, you know, we have to recognize that talent. We have to keep having these very important and sometimes uncomfortable conversations. So, you know, Ed, I would just say bravo to Wintrust for being brave enough to have the conversation and to not leave any topic off of the agenda.
I agree. I agree. It absolutely gives me hope. As I said, when my career started and I was moving in different aspects of my career, I was the first, and many times I was the only, and I knew I wasn't going to be the last. And I had to make sure I wasn't the last. And where I stand right now in kind of the twilight of my career, I'm looking back and I see so many people of color who are in engineering, who are in physics, who are making sure that there is a landing on Mars and all these things. So there is hope. You can never give up hope. And I too am grateful that, Ed, we're having this conversation, because I would say some decades ago, no one would dare have this conversation. So I think there is hope.
I would say I have a long list of reasons that I'm hopeful. But the one thing that I've appreciated is how visible the issues have been around race in the last year or so. They've been negative, they've been challenging and heartbreaking, but I think they've really opened eyes in a way differently than we have seen in a long time. And a number of people, young and old, are understanding that we've got to move beyond this if we want to survive. And so I'm hopeful that, because we're exposed to, unfortunately, some of the tragedies that people are experiencing, that we will wake up and turn the corner and be persistent and get this done.
Well, this has been wonderful. I appreciate everybody staying on an extra 15 minutes. I want to thank each of you for being part of this important conversation, and for the contributions to Wintrust as our board members. Perspectives are invaluable. I again learned a lot here. We strive, I think it's the Jesuits and the nuns who helped me form it, but we always try to do the right thing here. And that's not going to change as long as I'm involved, and we'll continue to do that. I hope you found this conversation as valuable as I did. This should be the first of many we're going to have. It's going to be part of our culture and our DNA. We're going to continue to have them, going to continue to challenge ourselves and go forward. So with that, I want to thank all of you for being here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa for her final thoughts. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, Ed. I just want to say bravo to every single one of you. It was just an amazing conversation. And I think we all heard time and time again that we've got to talk about what the realities truly are. And I think our panelists, Jim, Cecilia, Suzette, Cheryl, Alex, you all were very, very candid and authentic in your responses, and we truly appreciate that. And I'd like to thank you, Ed, for, first of all, providing the platform. You agreed right away to have this conversation. You pulled all of our board directors together last summer in July in the heat of everything to talk about what was going on and what our response was going to be. And this is just more of a testament to your commitment and your support. And for this work, it's truly important, and we couldn't make a step forward without it. So I thank you for your continued support of what we're doing, making room for difficult conversations, and of course for the flawless moderating that you gave to this evening. I also want to thank Luke and Paul from Chicago Innovation. They did a fantastic job, even with the music coming in at the end.
I love the music, man. That was awesome.
Yeah, we'll know next time to bake the music in up front. But we really appreciate you being our premier technology partner and producing tonight's program. I'd also like to thank the diversity inclusion team. We're a small but mighty team, and we get a lot done in a short period of time. And we spend time talking with our board directors and our various chief executives around the company, really checking in to make sure that we are doing the right things for the right reasons, as Ed said. And I'd also like to thank the Multicultural Professionals Network, which is one of our 3 business resource groups, for their input in shaping tonight's event as well. It's a conversation that will continue both internally and externally on some level. And so last but not least, I'd certainly like to also thank all of you who took your time out of your schedule to join us this evening. You showed up, and I saw a lot of the chatter on chat, and that's just what we wanted to have happen. Don't let your conversations end here. Find your circle, influence the thinking, influence those around you, and it's one step at a time that we can bring about change together. So together, any and everything is possible. Good night and happy Black History Month. I'd like to now turn it over to Luke.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm just going to echo the gratitude train here to thank you and thank kudos to you, Ed, for leading this outstanding session with some incredible leaders in our community. Thank you to Wintrust for remaining one of the most vocal champions of diversity, equity, inclusion in Chicago. And I too thought today's session was incredibly enlightening, but more so really profoundly necessary for all of us, no matter who you are, to focus on equity and not only in our workplaces, but clearly in all of our individual lives as well. So, again, very grateful to you, Melissa, Ed, Jim, Suzette, Cheryl, Cecilia, and Alex. What a powerhouse fivesome you were. And for shining a real important light on this conversation that all of us need to be a part of to create meaningful and lasting solutions. So I personally hope a lot of positive change flows from today's event, and I think it will. So until next time, everyone stay well. We hope to see you again soon, and good night.